driving traffic through Amazon, through YouTube, and through social media, and the whole thing's $600 a month. So when we tell people that product, the response for the most part is, wow, I want to do that. That sounds great. I spend more than that now, and it's really hard, and you're saving a big headache. It's just people want to do it. Which, when we set it up that way, that means that selling that and marketing that product is going to be super easy. Which is different than, let's say, if we wanted to create a course that teaches people how to be good writers. Right? So we're taking the same, basically, capability, which is that we understand content marketing and how to write in a way that's compelling. And we could create a video course that people buy that teaches you how to be a good writer. But that's a much harder road, don't you think? And first of all, it's hard to teach people how to be good writers. Second of all, would you pay $1,500 for me to teach you how to be a good writer? That's a much tougher sell than don't worry about it, it's handled for you. So this is just an example of, you pick a different strategy, you take the same kind of capabilities, you pick a different product strategy, and then it's easy. People kind of flock to you instead of it being hard, and you have to grind it out. So if you're grinding it out, or if you have any tough decisions, well, it's a product of a bad strategy. So let's talk about these 5 aspects. You ready? Have I stalled long enough? The first is that you want to predict nonlinear trends. Great strategies predict nonlinear trends, trends that go like this. Cyclical trends. The reason for this is that if something is going up for a while, like housing prices or inflation, if it starts to do this, if there's a trend more and more and more, there's this insane thing that humans do, which is that they predict that it's going to keep doing that forever until it reaches infinity. So if it's getting colder and colder, humans think it's just going to keep getting colder and colder and colder and colder. If housing prices are going up, they think they're just going to go up forever. And then they make their buying decisions or their competitive decisions on that basis. But in fact, most trends are not linear. Most trends are nonlinear. Most trends are cyclical. Trends like privacy. So, there's less and less and less privacy, right? Have you noticed? And the youngest generation that's now entering the workforce, Generation Y, prefers it that way. They actually like less privacy, right? With their texting and the Facebook and all of the social media companies, which are based on sharing publicly things that my parents' generation didn't tell their friends, right? But now it's kind of like advertised on a billboard. So you could think that privacy is just going to keep going away until we're all living in houses with no walls or something, right? You could think that trend is just going to keep going and going and going forever, and you can make a business decision around that, a strategic decision that relied on the trend of privacy just keep going and going and going. When in reality, privacy, if you track in history, privacy goes like on a 4-generation cycle. There's a low for one generation, and then it's on the rise for a generation, and then it's at peak for a generation, which is going to be Generation Y. And then it's on the down slope, and then it's a low again, right? So over 4 generations, it does a complete cycle, which means that you can count on, for the next 10 to 15, 20 years at most, there to be less and less privacy, and then after that, there's going to be more and more. Which means if you mark in your calendar now, 9 years in the future, or 10 or 12 years in the future, hey, privacy is coming back, then you could start to look at what kind of products and services might you sell that are going to be more appetizing to a community of people who are more interested in privacy. And it's going to be a hard slog if you sold those today in the broader market, but it would be an easier sell 9 years from now. So this is what I mean by predicting nonlinear trends. Another example, just a silly example, if you imagine imagine kind of the global temperature is getting colder and colder and colder and colder and colder, and you recognize that it's a nonlinear trend and it's going to get warmer again. One thing you could do is buy an ice cream store. And what's cool about that is that the ice cream store is going to be really cheap, because the collective thinking is that it's just going to get colder and colder and colder and colder. There's not going to be any demand for ice cream. But you know that it's going to turn around. So you go by this really cheap ice cream store, and people look at you and go, "You crazy? What you doing?" And you say, "I know it's going to get colder and colder and colder, right?" And they go, "Yeah, obviously." And the news will confirm, by the way, the linear thinking. But then when it turns around, suddenly you've got this inexpensive ice cream store and customers around the block, because now it's hot again. You follow what I'm saying? So predict nonlinear trends. The second piece is you want to change your customer behavior, but change it the least. What follows, if you think about, people tend to resist change. Have you noticed that? They tend to resist change. One of the reasons they resist change is that things are pretty good right now. They're okay. I'm alive. I'm breathing. That's pretty good. But if I do something different, that could change. And so whatever I have that I care about, whatever I have that I want, whatever I have that's going well, my fear is if I change, I'm going to lose something that's important to me. So I don't want to change. And often, your products and services are to help customers get a benefit that they need to change somehow in order to get. Does anyone have something like that? If you have a new way of doing things, or you have a product which is that saves someone time, or if you are, like me, I'm in the business of changing people, right? Of giving people a different future. Well, if I ask you to change a lot in order to take advantage of the value that I have to give you, I'm going to have a much smaller customer base. I'm only going to have the customers who are happy about change, who want to change, which is, 8% of the population or less. And if I can think of, well, what's something I can do to change customer behavior the least but still get the most of the value, then that's going to work. One of my favorite examples of doing this poorly was the Apple Newton. Do you guys remember the Apple Newton? The Apple Newton was the first, it was like a smartphone, but it wasn't a phone. It was what do they call those? PDAs. It was the first PDA, the first pocket computer, basically. And it was by Apple. And it was a disaster. It was one of Apple's 2 or 3 most famous, most colossal mistakes, most expensive mistakes. And the Apple Newton, this is in the 80s, I believe. The Apple Newton allowed you to make your calendar appointments, write notes to yourself, and book travel using the Sabre system from your pocket. You could actually book travel, which sounds great now, right? I mean, that's a no-brainer. That will totally work. But at the time, the way that you booked your travel was to call a travel agent. And you didn't carry your calendar in your pocket. The calendar was on your desk or in one of those big folders, a file of facts. So the idea of having your calendar in a different place just didn't work. I remember seeing someone, an early Newton user, and they'd take their Newton out and they'd put it on their calendar, and they'd write in the Newton the calendar, and then write it also in their calendar, because they just couldn't get their mind around only having the calendar in this little box. It didn't seem to work. So that was asking customers to change their behavior too much. But when it came to the iPhone, Apple got smarter, and the idea for the iPhone, as you can imagine, came right after the Newton. They said, hey, well, we got to do it. We'll include the phone. As soon as cellular technology went digital, they're like, we're going to do an iPhone. I'm patting my pocket because I have one here. So, but they didn't come out with it right away. what they did something I thought was genius, which is they tracked the percentage of people in Asia that were using their phones for text messaging. They looked at how popular is text messaging getting in Asia. Now, part of why they picked Asia is because they saw Asia in the realm of phone as a leader. In other words, whatever's happening in Asia in a few years was going to be happening everywhere else. That had happened with digital, happened with a couple of other things with the number of people carrying phones. So they saw Asia as the leader, the trendsetter, and then they were looking at how many people are actually using their phone to text message. So they figured once you're typing into your phone and messaging, it's a much smaller customer change to type into an application something. Right? It's typing. It's still typing. And so they created a phone with text messaging and email, because that's a text message and an email. Once you're doing this, it's real similar. And then they gave you these other applications, which were like a gateway drug into the iPhone that we now have and the whole idea of smartphones. So this is an idea of changing your customer behavior at the least. Does that make sense? Can you guys think of ways that you're asking currently your customers to change their behavior for your convenience? You know, don't do it this way. No, you have to use the other key. No, go around back. No, you can't buy that here. You have to buy it over here. That kind of stuff. So the more you build your business around the customer's ability to not change, the easier it will be for them to give you money, which is good. Okay, number 3. Strategic geniuses define a game that only they can win. They define a game that only they can win. And this can be hard sometimes. This is one of the reasons why I think it's good to have a mentor or a board of advisors or a leadership coach, because one thing I've noticed just being here in central Louisiana so far, the one thing that's been most remarkable, the most different culturally for me, this is the first time I'm here, is your humility. You probably don't know this about yourselves, but you're tremendously humble. It's very charming. It's endearing. It makes me feel comfortable around you and makes me like you. Anytime someone says something good about someone else, they say, "Oh no, it's really you." It's just really gracious. It's beautiful. So don't change that. So if I asked you to change, that would be against my advice. Don't change that. However, you might get someone else who knows you real well, who believes in you, who is committed to your success in business, to tell you the advantages that you have or that your business has, to kind of list what's really special about your business and what's really special about your leadership in it, or yourself as an entrepreneur. Because it's going to be hard for you to admit that's true, that there is something really good and special about you. It can feel like boastful or something, right? So get someone else to tell you, and if they're a friend, if they're smart, believe them. Don't fight them on it. Just, you're going to want to say, well, no, I just got lucky. That was someone else. Well, nice of you to say so, but just hear all that in your head and let it go, because that list is the key to playing a game that only you can win. That list is a list that speaks to your genius. I like to use that word a lot, genius, and part of why is that I've noticed that we all have areas of extreme competence, and those areas correspond to our deepest flaws. Because what happens is we notice that we have a flaw, and we start to practice compensating for that flaw. And then we practice and we practice and we practice for 10,000 hours, and we practice for 50,000 hours, and we get really, really good at compensating for that flaw. In fact, so good that the flaw has long ago been compensated for, and now we've developed this area of genius. When you look at someone else, though, and you see someone being a genius, it was like I was talking about the strategic geniuses. When you see someone who's just amazing at something, it just looks like magic. It looks like grace. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do they do that? And then when I ask you, what's your genius, the natural thing for you to do is search for you when you feel inside like that guy looks on the outside, just like amazing. And most of us don't have that feeling very often. But that's actually not what genius feels like on the inside. In fact, that moment of grace where that guy's doing something amazing, either with his mind or his body, his heart, whatever it is, he or she is just nailing it. It doesn't feel like grace to them. It feels like, no big deal, that's just easy. So if you want to search for your own genius, another way is to look for what's easy for you that other people mysteriously seem to have a hard time with. If it's like no big deal for you and other people complain about it, then that's an indication. The reason it's no big deal for you is because you're awesome at that thing. And the other people aren't. They're just normal like me. And so it's difficult for us. But for you, it's just no big deal. So on the inside, genius feels like no big deal. On the outside, it looks like amazing. Important to keep that in mind. So once you've listed that thing, then you can say, hey, you know what, I'm really good at this, I'm really good at this, I'm really good at this. I'm going to build a strategy that relies on those things, a game that is defined by that. Because then if you have competitors or other, they just can't play. One of the people I've been fortunate enough to work with, his name's Paul Sutter. He's one of my favorite strategic minds. He was an early employee at Alta Vista, and also the founder of a couple of companies, Orbital Data, and most recently QuantCast. If you do any work with the internet, you'll probably know QuantCast because they are the audience measurement system now that's used. So if you want to know what the demographics are of your website, QuantCast can tell you a lot about that. Paul's companies tend to, when he's done with them, tend to be worth $300 million to $500 million, something like this. And he said, I asked him about competition once, when you're thinking about your strategy, what role does competition play in your thinking? And he says, well, if I find that I have a competitor, I just do something else. At first it seemed kind of glib, but then I began to understand what he means, which is define how you're doing, define your brand, define doing what you're doing in a way that no one else is doing that. I was just speaking with a young woman before coming on here about her business. Can I speak about your business? Yes? Okay, good. So she has a business that sells flowers that have logos or messages printed on the flowers, right? So it's a branding opportunity. It's an opportunity to propose. We were talking about it as it's an opportunity to create an indelible impression, a flower that you're going to remember, possibly for the rest of your life. So this is playing a game only you can win. If you have relationships with the people who can do the technology of printing the stuff on the flower, and you've got let's say you've got relationships with some of the major companies and sponsors that are going to do events that need this. No one else can win at that game. Do you know what I mean? It's not just a unique idea, but it's a unique idea that relies on your specific advantages. Do you guys get a sense for what your specific advantages might be? Do you have one or two in mind? Is anyone like, I don't have any advantages? Anyone think that? It's okay. You do have them, and you don't have to raise your hand and single you out, but I promise you've got them. One thing that only my best friends know about me is that I'm very lazy. This is very obvious to my parents, but not so obvious so much to the other people around me. And my first business was in the entertainment industry. I was actually doing sound editing and sound effects for student films and for low-budget films, and then eventually for big-budget films in Los Angeles. That was my first business. Started it in college in my friend's kitchen. And in 1996, I had 4 days off, and Christmas was not one of them. And I worked between 16 to 22 hours a day. My longest work day without sleep or food breaks was 72 hours, one solid stint, because we were working on a television show, and as I like to say, the television companies get really cranky if the time for the show comes and they don't have anything to play. So you kind of have to get it done no matter what, even if they don't have all of the preparation done prior to that part of the process. So how am I working all so hard if I'm lazy? I would say I'm lazy, and people would say, you work harder than anyone else I know. I don't understand. But it's really hard for me to get motivated to do things that I don't feel like doing. And it's easy for me to do things that I like to do. So if I have a commitment and it requires me doing something I don't want to do, then I'm going to procrastinate. I might even break the commitment. It's just not that cool. What that created in me, so as a kid, it was a disaster. I would never do any homework. I wouldn't do any chores. What that created in me, though, is I was always looking for what's the least amount of effort that I can do that's going to have the most amount of results here. What can I do? What's the one page of the book I can read to get a C on a test? That was my, what's the 4 days of the semester I could attend and not fail? Those were the kind of questions that I was working. And, and I have probably 30,000 hours thinking about that. So I'm really accomplished. I'm really experienced at that question. And what's that's created for me now is in people, in systems, in companies, in business strategy, I have a genius for finding the leverage points, for finding the highest leverage move. If we speak for about 15 minutes about your situation, I'm going to be able to tell you exactly the highest leverage move that you've got, because I'm trained in seeing them. Now, why do I have that genius? Well, because I'm lazy, right? And then my commitment, what I care about, what I'm interested in, just got larger and larger and larger, such that when you stacked up all the highest leverage moves, I work a lot. I spend a lot of time doing the things I care about doing. But it's not because I like to work. It's because I've got a huge commitment that's motivating to me and inspiring to me. And I'm able to chunk that down into only a few leverage points, which take now, something like 10 to 12 hours a day. Does that make sense? So that's how a flaw or something you're not proud of or a character defect can turn into your genius. Every genius started out as a defect, and every defect becomes a genius. Always. I've never found it to be any other way in any person I've ever spoken to. Now, once you know that, then it's a matter of how do you leverage that, or how do you apply that genius to your strategy to make sure that the game that you're playing requires someone to play it who has that genius, and then you can win. Nobody can beat me at the leverage point game because they haven't spent 30,000 hours being lazy. Does that make sense? I actually think we mentioned a little bit about competition versus contribution. I think that we're, as an economy, going to move away from competition altogether. I think that we'll have every single business offer something unique that no one else offers, and that'll find an appropriate audience. I'm starting to see this a lot in the restaurant business, where it's not just that there's Mexican or Chinese or American food or diner restaurants, but more and more restaurants have a specific, unique thing about them that nobody else has, and it's really that unique flavor, that unique characteristic that's just shaped around the restaurant owner and the chef. And if there's a Mexican food place in San Francisco called Gracias Madre, and Gracias Madre is made. It's awesome Mexican food. It's very yummy, but it's all organic, vegetarian, and they even have some vegan options and stuff like that. So if there's a regular Mexican place that opens up next door, that's actually not competition for Gracias Madre, right? They're not the same thing. And some customers might want one, and some customers might want the other, but it doesn't present a threat, right? And so in my vision, that could happen, and the owners of those two restaurants would help each other be distinct, figure out what the other Mexican restaurant's genius is, and highlight that, and make that present in the brand experience. When we all do that, we're going to live in a much more vibrant, much more interesting, much more entertaining, much more value-filled world. And so that's part of what I want you guys to do is that individuation. Make your brand, make your company that much more unique, and don't be afraid to form it around your own personality, because you are the entrepreneur. All right, number 4. You want to create a venue for third-party value exchange. So this is a big one. This is of these 5. This is the one that, in my view, is the most significant for determining the speed of growth. The nonlinear trends one, I think that's number 1. Predicting nonlinear trends. That guideline is really important for making sure you have a business which has longevity, which stays for a long time, that you don't have to keep rebuilding and reinventing. This one is probably the most important guideline for determining how fast you grow. Every business that I've ever seen in a rapid growth condition, adhered to this guideline. So let me explain what it is. I want you to imagine like a system with only 2 people in it, 2 objects, 2 nodes. If we talk about system theories, there's or network theory, you have nodes and you have connections, right? The nodes are like the little dots, and the connections are the lines between the dots. So if you have a system that has 2 nodes, 2 dots, and 1 line between them, where value exchange works like you have the customer and you have the business, and the customer gives money to the business, and the business gives value of some kind through products and services to the customer. You have that exchange that goes across that line, right? That's called a binodal system, because there's 2 nodes, binodal. And that business model is difficult. And growing that business model is a slog. You have to invest a lot of time, energy, and money to try and get as many of those other customers to come and give you money in exchange for the value, in exchange for the service or product. And they also tend to experience what are called local maximums, meaning the surrounding environment allows them to grow so big, and then that's it, and then they stop. And some of you might be experiencing a local maximum, and you might think it has to do with Central Louisiana, or your type of business, or your industry, or your block, or your location. But in fact, it has to do with the fact that you've got this binodal system. So a multinodal system, lots and lots of nodes where there's lots of network connections. The more nodes you add to the system, the more network connections you have, right? And the more network connections, the more value that's being exchanged in a system. So if you can build a sandbox where other people come to exchange value to each other, then you've got a multinodal business model, or you've created a venue where third parties, not you, can exchange value with each other. The value that the third parties exchange in that venue is correlated then to the value of the venue and your value. So you think about the huge internet successes, eBay, Google, Facebook, the iPhone. They've all of those companies have created an environment where people are exchanging value with each other. And then, just like a casino, they take a little bit on each one. And they either do that like eBay as a literal fee, or they do it through a bidding process like Google, or they do it by collecting information which has value and then using that information for advertising the way Facebook does.